those of you that don't know me, my name is Barry Cranford. I'm the organizer of the London CTOs and also run RepWorks, a tech recruitment company. We do loads of stuff around the tech community, so mentoring, introductions, and we run about 14 groups. So if anyone's interested in any of that or looking to hire, feel free to check out the link, and I won't say anything else about it, or at least I'll try not to. But yeah, so this is our first London CTOs roundtable in a while. We're joined today by Hywel Carver from Skillaway. So Hywel and I were having a bit of a chat about talent retention and keeping developers and what he's doing over in Skillaway. It seemed like a great topic to run a roundtable around. Obviously 24 people, so it's clearly something of interest there. So we're going to be covering all kinds of topics around developing developers, so how that impacts talent retention, how to run it all that kind of thing. It's very much intended to be a roundtable, so feel free to turn your cameras on. You're all very welcome to. You can just unmute your mics, put your hand up or your virtual hand up, or put a comment in the little chat box, and we'll try and get it going. We've got some questions to kick it off, but like I say, if you want to dig deeper into anything, then we don't really mind where it goes. These ones are always more interesting when they're more organic led, and then we find the event kind of covers what you guys exactly want it to do. So yeah, so that's, I'll stop talking for a minute then, and let Hal introduce himself a little bit more and the business and what's led to today.
Awesome, thanks Barry. Yeah, I was asking myself that same question actually. When you said that you were going to ask me to introduce myself, I figured I should work out why I was so interested in learning. And I think, so I'm very passionate about learning for dev teams. And I think it's because I've been leading dev teams for like 9 or 10 years. And learning always feels like it has the potential to be the silver bullet. Not for every single problem, but for a whole lot of problems can be solved if I can only get these people from here to there. And so it feels like a solution to so many different things. So during that 9 or 10 year period, I was thinking about this. I wrote down some examples because I did quite a bit of consulting for a while. And I think in one 6-month stretch, I was with teams where they had this massive problem because there were like 7 data scientists writing Python that was poor quality, but very good at exploring different data science options, and 1 Python developer who was in charge of productionizing all of that Python. And he was one of the most stressed out people I've ever worked with. I think he quit shortly after I was involved with the company. I don't think he's there anymore. And it just felt like, if only I could take those people and make them write better quality Python, or at least get the Python a bit more ready for this other person to work on, then a lot of problems would be solved. And then I went to another company. Actually, I think they were overlapping. I was at these companies at the same time, and they had some very able developers already across parts of the stack, but they had rewritten their mobile app in React Native. And that wasn't something that any of these existing developers were familiar with. And so I spent maybe 4 or 5 months looking for a React Native developer to come in and lead on developing the app, hopefully supported by the rest of the team. And every time we got close to hiring one, the person we were looking at would get snapped up by Facebook or a similarly huge company. We just couldn't hire a senior React Native developer at the time. And it felt like if only the right thing existed, I could take these people and just add some skills to what they can already do, and that would solve this other problem. There was the ambitious team with really limited resources that wanted kind of constant progress, and everyone needed to be full stack in order to avoid bottlenecks. And we just couldn't make everyone senior enough across the stack, like skilled enough across all the tech they were working on. And there was a team that was abandoned by all of its seniors, and all the remainders had no idea how to address the large mountain of technical debt that had built up. And so this is all a long way of saying that, to me, learning and training for development teams is the solution to so many problems as a technology leader, that I think it's really important and central to how I think about technology and teams in technology. And you mentioned that this is what our company does, Barry. We created a new form of training and a company to go around it based on answering the question, what if training actually could make the impact that I wanted it to? And I'm very happy to kind of share the secret sauce behind that today. But I'd also really like to learn how other people already think about training, because I think it's a very diverse and interesting landscape.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to kick off beyond that then. Now we've got a sort of an idea, a bit of the background. Firstly, focusing on talent retention. So Dave, you obviously said it up front, talking about how you keep the gifted and the skilled people. You mentioned there about the chap that was under the pressure, and if you could have just upskilled him, then maybe he wouldn't have left. And I can imagine someone like that leaves a huge gap in the team. So can you just talk a little bit around why, in your opinion, like leveling up and training is a better alternative than losing people and hiring, and how it sort of fits together?
Yeah, well, in that case, I think actually the people I wanted to level up were the 6 or 7 data scientists, because they were already writing Python. It was just exploratory kind of rough around the edges Python that we couldn't let go anywhere near production. But you're right that I think there is one role of training, which is in retention, in team retention. And I think that comes from the fact that most developers know that this isn't going to be the last job that they work. They know that the kind of technology world is changing pretty fast. And so they want to be learning. There are always other things out there. If you're a React team using Java on the back end and Oracle as your database, you might be a bit interested in what people are doing with Angular and, I don't know, Django and Postgres or Mongo even. And so there's that constant desire, I think, as a technologist to find out more about those alternatives, the kind of paths not taken, and know what other technologies are out there and when they're useful. I think that's, to me, there's a kind of one role of training, which is that bottom up, we want to retain the team, and these people are really passionate about Golang, so let's find a way for them to explore that passion without having to go and join a company that works in Golang. And then there's another role of training, which is a kind of business need, and that's more top down. That's like, I as a leader see this problem in the team. I as a leader see like this person hates their job and these 7 people cannot get their stuff to production through this one person bottleneck. And I want to solve that problem. And to me, I guess those are different motivations for training that achieve different things.
Interesting. And how do you necessarily, like again, you talk there about how training can help retain the team. You talk about, the people might want to see that the path's not taken with Angular versus React and that kind of thing. But how does that necessarily, how would training those people, again, in your opinion, keep them? Like, is it just ticking a box, or is it genuinely trying to, I don't know, just walk me through your thinking around that?
Well, in the conversations I have, people tend to talk about that kind of training as having an impact on churn. That's the kind of the top level motivation for that training is employee churn. And I think the way it works is giving people access, opening the kind of door to the buffet and saying, here is all of the nice training food you can go and eat and choose from. And what that gives people is a perk, and it's a really strong reason to stay in a job. It's the ability to, I'm writing the code that you want for 90% of the week, but maybe every so often I take an hour and I go and get to watch a video that just broadens my horizons and teaches me something new. I learn about something that I didn't know before. And I might not be able to actually go and do that in my job. It might not impact the day-to-day, but I as a developer get that satisfaction and that kind of the warm and fuzzy feeling that comes from personal growth, I think.
Okay, I like this. Open the doors to the training buffet and see all the different things that people could get trained in. Does this mirror how other people are feeling about training? What other people have seen people leave for reasons of being underskilled or looking elsewhere, wanting to visit the buffet? And feel free just to unmute your mic, or again, hand up if you've got anything you want to add there. Will, yeah.
Yeah. I agree. How I think that you characterized it as 2 different things there. One is, I suppose, training from a personal point of view and how that kind of impacts people's happiness and job satisfaction. But also, I mean, the example that you have of the Python team, that's really like an example of a key person risk, right? That I suppose could have been mitigated if it had been seen in advance. So I think they're 2 very different things. I guess on offering people the doors to the buffet, I'm kind of interested whether, like, how much of a significant difference that makes if they're not able to use some of those new skills actually and apply them in their jobs. I mean, it's kind of easy to set up a learning budget, say, and go, go and buy the books that you want and go and watch the videos that you want. But like, is it important that people should actually be able to use that stuff?
I think yes. So we've got Udemy and given our developers unlimited, and everybody in the company unlimited access to that, which is great, and people are using it. But if I don't have an app or a microservice or something in language X and they're learning language X, they're not learning the language X. They're playing around with it, right? I watch a video. That doesn't mean I've learned anything. It means I've watched a video. So the learning and the true development happens when you give them a project that they can take this new learning and apply it and bring it into production, right? And so if you say, hey, they're interested in Golang, great. Find a few services that you want to build and build them in Golang. And be prepared that it's going to take you 5 times as long as in their preferred go-to choices, but support that, right? And support, but I think even more so, if you're looking at AWS is a great example, I think, right? And I have the benefit of having a great DevOps team or great infrastructure team, and they're learning constantly new stuff, right? But they're not learning it because I say, do this training, do this training. They learn it because they're curious and allow them to apply that, right? And so whether they then learn through, YouTube or Skillaway or Udemy or talking to other people or whichever way, doesn't even matter so much. What matters is the ability to apply this learning in production, into day-to-day life. That's how they grow, in my world at least, right? And of course, you need to sometimes just explore the rest of the world out there and see what's new without being able to apply it. That's as much part of learning. But I think if you want to have an impact on happiness, retention, and your business at the same time, then you need to create the opportunity to take this training and turn it into production code.
Yeah, I definitely agree with parts of what you say. I think the real learning happens by doing. I don't think it's the case that all training is as passive as something like a Udemy, where you are kind of not working in a project. I think though, Will, you mentioned about the kind of key person risk with that one team, and I think if you're allowing individuals to go and decide that they're going to implement this part of the production code base in Rust, and then someone else is like, actually Haskell would be fun over here, and someone else thinks Scala would be fantastic over here, you're kind of embracing that key person risk, which maybe that is fine for the kind of company you're in. I suspect some people would be kind of nervous of that. And I guess I don't want to put all learning under the category of purely passive. You can only actually learn when you then go and try in production, because I think some learning does allow people to avoid trial and error in production, which we would generally want to avoid, I think, as tech leaders. I don't know, have you found problems with that, Thomas, where people have decided to implement something and then no one else can support it afterwards?
An entire company full of that at one point in my career, where one of the tech leader at the time, he had a team of really good Ruby developers, right? And he decided for some reason or other that he wanted to do everything in Clojure from now onwards. So none of the developers were happy. None of them knew how to build anything. And so everything ground to a halt for 1.5 years until enough developers had picked up sufficient knowledge and skills to actually do anything in production with that. So I think that was one example. Other than that, I think we've always been able to manage it fairly well. So where you say, let's not just go overboard and build all kinds of stuff in all kinds of languages, but pick something that is mission critical so that if it blows up, it doesn't destroy your entire business, but it just has a little blip. Let's put it this way. So, and that's how you introduce new tech, at least, right? If it's just more being better at what you're already using, that isn't so much of a risk. So that's much. So if you're a Java developer and now you're learning 16 new different open source libraries that are awesome and help you become better and faster and whatever, I think that risk is much, much smaller and much easier contained as well. right? But if somebody says, I want to build this new service in something nobody else on the planet has ever heard of, you probably don't want them to do that, right? Especially not if it's mission critical.
Great. Okay, I'm interested in picking up on something you mentioned there, how when you were talking about the difference between bottom up, talent retention, and top down, when it starts with a business need, and you can see as a CTO, as a leader, there are gaps that you want to push down. How do you do this in terms of a team that has like different training gaps, where there's different things in different places? Like, how do you stay on top of that, and especially as everything is changing? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's not rocket science, right? Because if a team has a gap, then you either find somebody who can help fill that, or if you have that knowledge yourself, then you work with them, or you work with a team or a small number of people individually to develop that knowledge together. Yeah. But there's no blanket approach, because every team is different. Every team has different gaps. Every person has different gaps, different development needs. So you really have to, either through the tech leads in the teams, or direct, depending on how big the company is, work individually with people to understand truly where they're struggling, right? What mistakes are they making? Why are they making those mistakes? And how can you help them avoid those in the future? What's the root cause individually? And that you need to talk to them. You need to look at their code. You need to talk about design with them, understand how they're thinking and where they're missing things. And then you can very, very, very tactical go in and beef up that strength. Now, that's one thing, right? If, of course, you say, hey, we're an on-premise company, let's say world largest bank or something like that, and you want to get into AWS, it's a totally different approach, right? Then you need to bring up a center of excellence around AWS, and then from there permeate all that knowledge into the rest of your company. It's a totally different problem to have. So it depends on very much on the size of the company you are, the team that you are as well. I think go ahead.
I completely agree with what you said, that there's no blanket approach. And actually, it's one of the things that frustrates me a lot about a lot of training that exists, is it really buckets people and says, you look like a mid-level Python developer. Don't worry, here's our course for mid-level Python developers. It's 44 hours of preset training, and that's how you get from mid-level to advanced. Oh, you're an advanced Python developer. Don't worry, we've got 50 hours of videos for you as well. And this kind of this idea that we can just take a person, be like, go through this factory, and on the other end of it, we'll have fixed your skill gaps or whatever. I just think doesn't make any sense. I completely agree. I think the point that you made about hiring is really right as well, that it's the first thing we all turn to when you identify that gap on a team. You think, if I can find someone who's already got that skill, that thing that I need, then we can just bring that person in. We'll like import the skill into the team that way, and then the gap will be solved. I strongly believe this enough that what you said is basically the first 2 slides of our company pitch deck. So I'm going to try really hard to not be pitchy here, but I fully agree with what you said. There is an alternative where you deeply personalize what you do learning wise. And so what you can do is assess people. And that's what you talked about, sitting down and having conversations, looking at people's code and noticing, it looks like you can do X and Y and not Z. And that lets you be very fine-grained. It lets you avoid wasting the time of people that are saying, here are 50 hours of videos, of which maybe 10 are relevant to you. It lets you really develop people at the kind of edge of their knowledge. Like, I think this is where learning is exciting, is if you imagine this kind of circle of stuff that you already know, what you want to be doing is just pushing out at the edge of that circle. Everything else is rubbish. If you're in the middle of the circle, it's stuff I already know. If you're way beyond the circle, I mean, I don't have the context to understand the new thing. And so this is actually part of the approach we use, which is to assess people first and then find those like very fine detailed skill gaps and like look at those. I feel like that hand next to Rob probably means that you want to say something, although I'm not a big Zoom user, so I'm not sure if that's true, Rob.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't want to interrupt. And actually, this is a point that's parallel to what both you and Thomas are saying, and that it's quite useful to bring in the lens as well of how you're going to evaluate whether this training has been useful to you in some way. And also, these are people, like all the developers that you're training are on a team trying to accomplish particular goals for the business that hopefully they have well in mind. So it can be interesting to go and explore a bit of, let me just understand functional programming a bit better, even though I'm not really doing that right now. But like, if you're going to spend any significant time in training, it has to be something that you can evaluate, and both, like, it should be relevant to them and what they're doing. They should be able to notice differences in their work, as well as just, you're in a business context. You have to decide if you're putting money and time into something that's definitely valuable.
Oops, I told you I wasn't a Zoom pro. I was talking while muted. Yeah, I completely agree. Like, it's the vitamin versus pill, right? It's the, like, am I investing in training because I want to avoid people losing? There's like a bad thing that I don't want to happen, the vitamin. And in that case, I think that's when people turn to like a £500 a year subscription to Pluralsight, or a kind of individual budget. Or is it the kind of pill of like, we haven't shipped code for 18 months because we're using Clojure and people on the team don't know Clojure yet, in which case there's like a really clear, like, there's a really clear link between company revenue, skills of the team, and like closing the gap that training allows.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, this is a quick point actually. There's also the secret blocker, in that you can, if you set up a budget and say, here's training, go ahead and do training. People they know that they're going to be evaluated on how they've done their work at some point, right? It's still relevant. And so they're going to be stopping themselves from doing training that actually might even be useful to them, because they think, if I can't show that I'm getting something out of this, then we're going to get to like a 6-month review cycle, and you'll say, oh, you haven't really done much in these last 3 months. And they've been doing a ton of training, but if they feel like they can't show anything, then they may also be stopping themselves quietly from doing something that might be useful.
So how do you solve that? I know I've got a friend of mine that's in a completely different industry, in the sales industry, who one of his like side hustles, side gigs, is to work with a company, follow up on a training course that they've done, and he has then 3, I think it's fortnightly sessions afterwards to understand the impact of that training and whether it's landed and what they've been doing, just to kind of reinforce it. And I've sort of taken a bit of a sideways turn on where I was going to go with the next question, but Hywel, I'm interested in your thoughts on that. If do you, with obviously you've put together a product around this, so you've thought about this reinforcement side of things. How do you do it? Is it important? How important? Yeah, keen to hear your thoughts around that.
I think it depends on a couple of things. It depends on the kind of thing that you are learning, like the nature of the thing, and it depends on the outcome that you want. So there are like multiple different kinds of learning that you can have. There's like knowledge, which is essentially data, it's facts. And skills, I guess, is like the next sort of level above that, where a knowledge is a thing that you know, and a skill is something that you can do, but you can't really explain how to do it. So like, I have the skill of picking up a glass of water, but I couldn't tell you mechanistically everything I did with my hand in order to do that. With knowledge, what really matters is repetition. So there's a kind of really commonly used approach, spaced repetition, where you basically tell someone something, test them on it, you come back some period again, you test them on it again, you come back some period again. I have an app on my phone called Anki that I use for like memorization, basically, of things that I find interesting. And that's exactly how it works. And that kind of spaced repetition is really important for retaining knowledge. With skills, it's the doing. So I think, Thomas, you touched on this before, that it's doing that reinforces the skill. Our approach, because what we do as a company is always relevant to what people need to be doing in their jobs, for us, the reinforcing happens in part of people's work. We make ourselves available to like answer questions that people have when they're coming to do things. But in the session, we teach people something and we have them do it in the session, but then the reinforcing should be happening as part of their work, because they're learning things that are directly relevant. So there's there's a framework that's very useful for thinking about this, which is the kind of level of engagement in learning and what you can expect to kind of get out of it, the kind of quality of the learning. And it's called the ICAP framework, which starts with the best and goes to the worst. So the best kind of learning, or let's start with the worst actually, because that's more obvious. Passive, the P at the end of ICAP, just means like sitting there and like taking something and like watching a video, reading a book, and just sort of absorbing information is passive. Next along is active, and active means kind of engaging with information as it comes in. So if you're watching a video and then you pause it and you take a second to think about what you just read and sort of fit it into your main mental framework, then that helps the kind of learning be that much stronger as a result. Next along is the C, which stands for constructive. So that means doing something with the thing that you learned. So actually, for us as developers, it would be writing code. Probably it would be, you know, I heard about this thing, I read about how this thing works in Clojure, and then I wrote some code with that. And then the kind of top of that list is the I, which is for interactive. So interactive, constructive, active, passive. And interactive is like, not only do I do something with the knowledge that I just gained, but I also have some kind of human interaction around it. I talk about, so in the Skill Well context, what happens in our sessions is people learn something passively and then immediately go and do it in code. And then we lead a discussion about the 4 different ways that people solve the problem and what the kind of the relative benefits and merits of each approach are. And so people do this as well with like brown bag sessions. That's kind of trying to be interactive. It often misses out on the actual doing part. But if you have someone who's like leading, like this actually is exactly a great example of an interactive session, because everyone here has gone away and tried to do like learning in part of an organization, or probably part of loads of organization, had successes and failures along the way. And so by having this be an interactive kind of human driven session, it is going to help all of us learn that much better about how to do training next time around. That was a much longer answer than I think you wanted, but essentially there's a direct link between the quality of the outcome of learning and the quality of the learning itself.
No, that was really interesting. It's sort of like, as you're talking, because I'm obviously not a developer, so I can't entirely relate with everyone, but I'm thinking about all sorts of different things, like my little ones at primary school now, and sort of tracing it back, and it all kind of makes sense. So yeah, no, it's a really good answer. Anyone have any follow-up questions that are perhaps a little bit more related on that one? Good. Again, feel free to raise your hand. Feel free to put any questions that you've got in the chat box, and if not, then I'll just keep going through. So one thing I did want to come back to was you said about, you talked about this skills audit that you mentioned, and I know you mentioned this to me before, assessing people first to find the skills gaps, but you went over it quite quickly. How do you do that, especially in like a, again, we've got CTOs from all sorts of different companies, sizes, team sizes, and all sorts, but thinking about like a startup where new people are coming in all the time and all this stuff is going on, how does that work? How do you understand without, and again, Thomas said, if you've got those personal relationships, then you know, the tech leads can see exactly what's going on and can have that kind of thing. And that's obviously the first choice, you know, that's a really good solution. But if there isn't that level, how would you go about auditing the skills gaps?
Well, I would definitely like to hear how other people are solving this problem, because I think it's a hard one. And Thomas, I'd definitely like to understand more about how you have those conversations. We in our approach, we go narrow and deep. So we take a specific technology and we try and understand every facet of it, like whether each individual knows or doesn't know that by means of an assessment. So people fill in essentially a quiz. We don't ask people to like write an entire code base, but with kind of an hour and a half of their time, we can take them from, do you know how to, I don't know, cast a string to an integer in this language, to do you know how to apply, I don't know, this design pattern, or this principle of code design, or this way to avoid tech debt, or use the debugger to achieve this. That's the aim of our quiz. We know it's very, very narrow. So it definitely, I think there's part of this that's how do you holistically decide what level a developer is. It takes into account a whole load of things like their maturity, their time management, their kind of interpersonal skills, communication, all of that stuff. We are just looking purely at the kind of technological learning in a specific technology. And so we do that by means of an assessment that, we've tried to put together to really cover the full range of a language. But I'm really interested in actually how other people solve this problem, because I know there are like SaaS products that you can use that try and give you an idea of what to measure and track it over time, like progression.fyi, I think is progression.io, which is also run progression.fyi, things like that. I'd be really interested to hear like the different approaches people are using.
Cool. If you, I'll jump in because you touched upon that, progression.fyi there, and progression app. So from being like, I'm the development manager at Tillo, and got 13, soon to be 15 sort of people in my development team now, and sort of we're sort of growing thick and fast. For sort of knowing the skills gap in if there's particular technology or particular area of the business. So it's not just obviously the technology that we use. We have got a sort of core competency framework that sort of I cobbled together over like the last 4 years. It's loosely based around Monzo's progression framework, and 2 of their employees actually left to go and build progression.fyi and the progression app. It's sort of the one of the first iterations on that is what we've got now, and that's really, really useful. It touches upon not only the technologies that we use as a business and as a team, but also all the business functions as well. So all the things that obviously the development team have to get involved with or have to know about, not just the technology that they use. So that's broken down into, I think, 6 different categories across 6 different levels. Level 1 being sort of the lowest, level 6 being the highest. And each one essentially builds on everything that went before it. So we have yearly sort of PDPs, so performance development plans. That's also a conversation that we have, checking regularly with the team. But that's more of a formal time set aside where we'll go through that, the core competencies and the progression framework. And we'll find gaps that they're interested in, things that they want to work on in their career. If there's any projects upcoming in our roadmap that we can obviously then, put into practice, make use of those different things. Essentially as the sort of levels progress, generally speaking, everyone we would hire would sit at least a 1, maybe a 2 kind of thing. Or if they're not necessarily doing it day to day in their role, they're more than capable of doing it. And then as the levels progress, it's less about you as an individual, but then upskilling rest of the members of the team. So in our world, I generally try not to hire in expertise if I can sort of upskill somebody, and obviously start shifting their time away from sort of doing, and then get obviously somebody in, say, lesser experienced in the company or in a particular technology, so that they can then sort of upskill themselves. So I think giving them the time and the safety, knowing that things may take a little bit longer. Obviously, exploratory learning is quite hard to quantify. I think having sort of a set defined goal or an end in sight, whether it's a particular project or some deliverable that they need to sort of to hand back at the end is useful. Obviously, if that's useful for the business, then it's a win-win. We take the approach of an RFC or documentation first as much as we can. So if there's any sort of significant change to the platform, to the services that we offer, we essentially put it out to the team. So the particular sub team that will be working on delivering that software or that code will sort of start writing up an RFCs that will form the documentation essentially that will be handed over at the end, that we will then, obviously, when we've all forgotten about it a few weeks later or a few months later, it's got all the decisions, all the discussions that we've had along the way. So that for us is sort of like, okay, well, the RFC is at the point where somebody goes, okay, look, we don't know we're doing here. This may be an unknown. This is a new technology we would like to try. It's at that point they present that, okay, this is the gap. This is what we're proposing, and it's then at that point you've got something concrete, something quantifiable that we can go, okay, cool. Do we need to get training on that, or do you need to spend some time, or do you want to explore a bit further? It could be a case of, yeah, is it a book? Is it a course? Is it some online videos? What is that? So for us, yeah, I think there really obviously is never one size fits all, but yeah, it comes back to sort of it's at what the company's working on, I think, is the key thing.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. Anyone else used progression.fyi, right? And anyone else used that and had any experience with that?
We don't, but we've also got a progression framework based on Monzo, but I think it's sort of sitting a little bit in the background. So what I found, what we're actually doing, it's not rocket science, it's not complicated, right? We do 360 feedbacks on everybody in the company, once to twice a year. That helps people understand how others perceive them, and that goes into the development plan, right? Then I have a discussion with everybody around their personal vision for the next 5 years. Where do they want to go? That flows into the development plan. But then other things, and then development plan training come together, right? But other things are very simple, right? You have incidents that are caused, and you do a post-mortem, and you understand there's a skill gap, there's a knowledge gap, so you can fill that. Or you just observe that something that the team should be able to build in a week takes 3 months and it's still not working correctly, right? So you look into the code base, you talk with the developers, you try to understand what's the problem, what's this missing piece, and you act on that. And then you have your business strategy. We want to explode into XYZ, right? That can drive development plans as well. Or people explicitly say, we don't know enough about Kafka. Can we do some training around that, for example? Those things happen, right? So all of that flows into your individual development plans, but it also flows into your overall engineering strategy. What do we want to accomplish this year? What are the biggest gaps that we see, and use offsites to surface them? You observe, and whether that's a technology question, a how to work together question, a understanding the business, not understanding the business that we're trying to support here, that all flows into that. So I think as CTOs, engineering managers, we have plenty of signal if we only look for it, right? So it's all around us. Every single commit is a signal. Every single time something that you thought would take X takes 2X, 10X is a signal. Every single time something doesn't work and the team can't get it quite right is a signal. They're all around us. There's no shortage of them, unless you have an amazing team that outdevelops the rest of the world, of course, right? But then there's also signals to look out for. So that's how I just do it very pragmatically in daily life. It's about 40 people in the org, but it scales as much as you can. Of course, what you said earlier, if you don't have the technical leads that you can trust and rely on, you have to start building those first, right? And hopefully you don't have 100 people with no good technical leads. If you have 10 developers and yourself, you can individually talk, not a problem. If you have 50, that doesn't work anymore. So scaling requires scaling the level right underneath you to the point that they understand it's how to do this well. And teaching them, and then so that you can multiply.
I think the challenge is often mapping from high-level things like strategy, or this project was really late, or these people say we want to get better at Kafka. The challenge is going from that to then an action that solves that problem. And so the teams that I see very often have signals like that, but their ways of getting there are, the ways of solving those problems often involve either bringing in people or they involve you, relying very heavily on your team leads who are not going to be perfect themselves. So again, I think someone asked at the beginning how you get learning for the best developers, and that I think is a genuine challenge, because your kind of highest level of developers have no one above them who's more expert than they are to say, actually, you always solve problems in this way, and that's pretty good, but you could also be doing this other thing some of the time. And so we again, the kind of assessment process that we use often surprises people, because we're able to show what the most senior people don't know as well. And sometimes, to be clear, that does not matter, because stuff that people don't like, stuff that someone doesn't know, doesn't always matter for their role. We're not interested as a company, and I'm not interested as a person, in kind of training people just because they have a skill gap there. It's only if it's relevant to what the company needs them to do that it's kind of exciting for everyone and worth looking at. And so for me, that's a kind of really critical point, is how you go from those like top level requirements to, and tomorrow now I'm going to do something different based on those.
And maybe it sounds complicated. Once you really look deeper into the thing, it usually isn't that complicated. It's fairly straightforward. Very, very simple example, right? I had a team and they couldn't figure out to get Google Analytics to work correctly with React, with a React application. So, okay, fine. Juniorish developers had never really built anything like this, maintained anything like this in production. And they tried, and the product guy said, we don't think the traces are right, and this doesn't work, and that doesn't work. At some point in time, I just opened up the editor and said, let me have a look. What have you built here actually in detail, right? And then I worked with them for a couple of weeks and fixed all our Google Analytics setup, which was wrong, which took some reading and some experimentation and some more learning on my side before I was ready to explain it to the other guys. And then I could take them by the hand and with them then said, look, this is going wrong here, there. This is what we need. This is what we don't need. Here's how this stuff works. And you take them by the hand and then they learn it. And next time they get it right. And I think if you say, we don't know enough about Kafka, well, that's of course super high level signal, right? But then you say, okay, how are we using it today? How are we supposed to use it? What are the issues we're seeing? Let's drill deeper, right? And so you drill deeper into the problem until together with a team, you understand what that is. And they may need learning on your part, that may need learning on their part, that may need reading, experimenting, prototyping, bringing somebody in from the outside to teach the team about the basics and fundamentals of how to do that stuff right. There's not a simple answer, but the first step is always to take one of these signals and drill deep until you truly understand, why did this go wrong, or what's missing here, right? And as soon as you understand what's missing, then the steps to fix it are fairly obvious, most of the times at least. And with behavioral problems.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
You mentioned in there a lot about like problems that need to be solved and sort of fairly obvious skills gaps and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I struggle in the other aspect where like we have a big team all using sort of fairly similar technology. So we have a good array of experts and juniors who are learning from each other, and incremental gains on learning more about that technology is quite good for having conferences and specific learning and stuff like that. It's the areas where like you just touched on it slightly there about these really high performing people within that team who are experts in that area and do want to learn. And I'm not massively keen on letting them run free with an insane technology in the middle of the stack. That weird Rust guy who loves Rust and is now part of a critical path. That worries me quite a lot, but I still want them to really get into Rust. And I'm a big fan of like just learning another technology, even if it's not directly applicable to your current job, you will learn extra things from it. So something is functional programming, you're used to object-oriented world, you'll still pick up almost transferable skills in that, if not directly using it. And if anyone's had that sort of an issue or a problem to face.
Yeah, No, definitely. And I think like one thing that struck me sort of hiring for software developers, let's say 2 years ago, was it was really hard to meet one that didn't say, I want to do more DevOps. Like, I'm really interested in DevOps right now. And then like that evolves into people a little bit further down the road that say, I'm really interested in Kubernetes, and I think we should be using it because it's really powerful and it's flexible and it's going to help us use microservices. And if that's a really dangerous point, because you can easily go down the route then of saying, yeah, let's explore that because it's something that motivates you, and it does seem to be a technology that people are talking about. But then are you kind of accidentally building a key person dependency around this new technology? And Kubernetes is a great example because it's really, really hard to use. And then what you realize is in another year's time, where nobody's that interested in DevOps anymore, suddenly you've got this thing that's really hard to support, and then you're left in a situation where maybe you've got to hire in experts to kind of unpick what's happened. So I think it's a really challenging thing to deal with the tension between what might motivate people and what represents a risk to the business potentially.
Yeah, I think there's two different thoughts on that, or two separate individual thoughts on that. One is this whole idea of a one-way door versus a two-way door in terms of decision making. If you decide to go Kubernetes from whatever you had before, you better go all in on that. Meaning you don't leave one person to dabble with it. You make this part of a concerted effort, and you make sure you acquire the skills as a team that are necessary to do this successfully. Now, that means you have to properly start in dev and build a cluster and shift some of your workloads there and get some experiences, and eventually start building it in production and running a few services there. And so that's an investment over time. And you don't take this lightly because it's going to cost you time, money, and incidents, most likely. Right? So that's a decision that you should take as a company, right? Or as a tech team. Is this the direction we want to go? Or is this something where we don't yet see the benefit of the doubt? And then you have other questions here where decisions are easily reversible and they're not expensive to do. So you can easily go into those, right? And that's one of the aspects. The other aspect just slipped my mind, unfortunately, but it'll come back, don't worry.
So we actually, I host a podcast called Primarily Context Based, which is, I think now at last is live on every podcast thing. And I think it was our second episode was addressing the question of should I use Kubernetes in production. The premise of the podcast is we take a question in every episode where the answer is very much it depends. And lots of people will tell you the answer is a binary yes or no. And should I use Kubernetes? Yes, because it's so powerful. I mean, so is a lion, but I don't want one in my house. I guess I think that skills are less binary than this though. Like I think the team being able to know, excuse me, Kubernetes is actually, there's a whole lot of sort of bits within that, bits meaning in the sense of 0 and 1, because there's really one skill which is around running a Kubernetes cluster, which actually is composed of lots of smaller parts, which is, do I know how networking works in Kubernetes? Do I know what happens if, like, how I can have multiple masters? Do I know how to execute a minor version upgrade or even a major version upgrade in my Kubernetes cluster? And then there's at least with the Kubernetes people, they separate it entirely from being an administrator versus being a developer, where there are again lots of skills like, do I know how to run a deployment and configure it for blue-green deployments? Do I know the difference between a service and an ingress controller? And all of those like much more granular things that you can take people and say, we need to learn Kubernetes and like, let's just throw you through everything. But I think there's an alternative where you want to be much more kind of fine-grained and say, well, you've already done some Kubernetes in your spare time and you know about a deployment and a service, but do you know the difference between configuring that service as a load balancer versus a node port and why you would do that? You can find the docs on all those things, but there's a good reason why developers are still not all perfect in the age when all docs are online. And that's the fact that there's a big gap between the knowledge of documentation and the skill of actually doing stuff.
And I remember the other part of my answer. So you're right. there's all kinds of gradations. I think the other question that you have to answer first is, what type of a company do you want to be? Do you want to be living on the bleeding edge, where you spend a small amount of time writing production code and a large amount of time exploring new tech that may benefit you? Or do you want to be playing it safe? You take the stuff that's now mainstream and you apply it, and you focus on developer productivity within a fairly safe and established set of technologies, but you still assimilate the new pieces as they come along? Or do you want to be one of those laggards that are dying because every single day that passes and they don't learn anything new, they fall further behind the rest of the world, right? And so none of us want to be the latter, right? So then the question is really, as an appetite for your company, which of the other two do you want to be, right? You want to play it safe and just adopt new stuff as it comes along and at a steady pace? Or do you bleed at the edge of this stuff with all the consequences that has, right? And that is a massive difference. If you have these senior guys who are eager and hungry to learn, right, they probably want to live at the bleeding edge, right? But if you want to do, if you have a different set of people, they maybe get quite comfortable of living sort of in the sweet spot of what is known and slowly moving with that sweet spot. So that's a question you have to answer before you go into these other questions, because that's a question that not the techies have to answer, but that the company as a whole has to answer. Because
I think I'm going to steal that as an idea for an episode of Primarily Context-Based, because it's exactly that. So, and I think you see this different answers in the same organization. I think there are banks in the UK that have, embraced cloud-based Kubernetes for some of their deployments, and yet they will also have some systems that only work on IE6. There are going to be the same different answers to that question in the same organization. And I think maybe at the heart of that question is how hard it is to move people from one of those worlds to the other. And so to me, this is one of the functions of training, actually, is if you have got your kind of COBOL team and they're all kind of still writing COBOL, even though it's, Chex Watch 2021, like finding a way of giving those people new skills and training them up is going to be part of the answer to modernizing and getting towards that, maybe not even the bleeding edge, but what was the bleeding edge 10 or 20 years ago, and allowing for progress. I guess, though, I think for me, that's a decision that isn't driven from the team themselves. It's driven from the company and the industry and the kind of external requirements on me. So I guess I want to call back to the example someone had earlier of a team that hadn't shipped in 18 months. If I'm a bank and my alternatives are learn something, like embrace something new and not ship for 18 months or carry on writing COBOL, I guess I see why they would choose COBOL. Like I would probably choose COBOL in that instance, honestly. I don't know if any banks actually use COBOL, but I'm just using it as a kind of example.
All the mainframe stuff is COBOL.
Sorry?
All the mainframe stuff is COBOL.
Right, exactly. And so the decision is, I think, is less driven by the people and more about what the kind of context of the company and the organization is. And then once you've worked out that context, the question is, how do I get my people from where they are to where I want them? Which might be, we just have to embrace a rebuild for 18 months, but hopefully it isn't that.
Well, I don't think there should be a differentiation between those two things. Like, are you on the bleeding edge or are you on kind of slightly safer / boring tech? I think I'd like to set up a function within the company, which is constantly looking at that bleeding edge, which would be the innovative individuals who are kind of keen on an area and going and diving in, and then almost a bottom-up approach to how we then integrate that back into the business and the wider scope of what everyone does. And I think that's where I like to look for training in these things, which may be not directly applicable to our current tech stack. Or
so the reason that I'm making
a question.
No, the reason I'm making a difference here is because it's different types of people and it's a different type of culture that you're attracting. So you have to be very clear on which of the two you want to hire. Because if you have half the team or one part of the team who wants to live on the bleeding edge and just break everything half the time, but gain massive gains as they do so, and the other half of the team or another part of the company says, don't rock the boat, right? And don't bring me anything new unless I absolutely have to learn, you have massive friction and conflict, which then will take one of the two teams and endlessly frustrate them, or even both, which then kills morale and productivity and everything else. So I think you do have to make that choice to some extent, right? Certainly in a small company, you have to make a choice there. If you have a very large company, I think you have the ability to ring fence the teams and make sure they don't have, that different cultures don't clash massively, and you have a defined path from one to the next. But in a small company, you have to be pretty clear on what you want to do, I think.
Melanie, yes, see you've got your hand raised. Did you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to say I have a small team, and we have a mix of people who are like pro bleeding edge and other people who are just interested in maintaining our legacy code. And it's a really good mix. We're able to manage the conflict productively and benefit from the people who have some cool new feature they want to try versus other people who are just happy to stay the course. So I wouldn't agree that it's a source of conflict or a weakness, but you can manage that in a small team to be like a good strength.
Melanie, do those teams work with different technologies, or are they all working on the same stack?
It's one product, one stack, but like the stack has different technologies in it. I'm not sure how to answer your question.
I feel like you did. I don't really know what my question was. I guess I was wondering if there were people, there were like the maintainers were working in Java 7, and then there was another group that was like writing Scala or Groovy or something else that was a bit more bleeding edge.
I mean, we have Python and Go, and we've gotten rid of all the Scala, and Terraform. Yeah, it's like a diverse stack, if that's what you mean.
Yeah, and it reminds me, there's that analogy people really often use, and I'm going to get the terms wrong, but there's like pioneers, colonists, and there are two versions of it. One is like quite colonial, and one is quite like authoritarian. I can't remember which is which. There's one that's like settlers, pioneers, and colonists. It's like the people who kind of make landfall and then start the first settlements, and then the people who kind of come later as kind of stages of maturity of tech team to deliver projects. And as you get larger, you really want a mix of those, where you have the people who are kind of forging new ground, and then the people who come and kind of stabilize things, and then the maintainers who come and ensure that everything carries on working in 5 years' time. And I think there's a military version of the same thing, which is like commandos, army, and police, or something like that. Or I feel like one of them has town planners in. Does anyone know what I'm talking about here?
I know what you're talking about.
Okay, great. Thank you, Melanie.
It's okay. Early stage companies tend to be more of like the going forward and the cutting edge people, but even in an early stage company, you can benefit from having some people who are just happy to implement, because you can't risk not shipping for 18 months. So in my opinion, you always need that mix, assuming you want to ship something sometime.
I think that's right. And I feel like to me, this feels different to training, because the way this is often talked about is just like it's in people's nature almost, that this is just where they're happy. This is like their kind of sweet spot, is they really like being the person who's kind of constantly like doing new stuff, or they really like being the person who's like the maintainer who brings stability. And I think it's none of those is a problem. It feels like a different, I don't think it's something where you want to train someone to be the one of the other archetypes. It's maybe a thing to sort of recognize and organize a team around, but not something to kind of fix in people. It's not a kind of skill gap or a lack of level. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
I mean, at some point, it gets very valuable to be able to articulate what risks are that you're bringing on board and what approach you're taking to them. Like, especially if you're using relatively cutting edge technology, that some of it is broken and you're going to need to keep pulling in new versions to keep things working. You have to be comfortable with the risks that come with that. And even sometimes if you're bringing in a relatively mature technology, but you don't have much experience or depth of experience on the team, you need to know what your plans are. If it just means that you're not building something that's even that similar to something that you've done successfully before. So you need to be ready to notice when here's something we thought would be relatively quick, and it's been 2 weeks and we're not really sure that it's even possible yet, or longer. You have to be aware of what you're walking into.
Yeah, I think I agree. Although I'm always wary about equating experience with skills. I think sometimes skills come with experience and sometimes they super don't. Like experience tells you that someone has solved a problem, but it doesn't always give you a proxy for whether it doesn't really tell you whether someone could solve that problem again, because it misses the context. And again, you can tell why we called our podcast primarily context-based, because that context is really important. The context in which you solved a problem should, if you're kind of good at solving problems, define how you solved it. And your experience over here might not at all relate to what you need to solve the problem over here. And I think conversely, one of the things we've heard before as a company is that you can't teach experience, which is actually exactly what we set out to do. And so I think if you want, like you talked about, letting people run kind of as a side project, either something that's like non-mission critical or is just like maybe an internal system. And that's exactly the right way. Like, I don't know if you call that experience, but it's exactly the approach you want to take, to like give people that sandbox, that simulated environment in which to gain something that feels like experience, maybe wouldn't count as experience on someone's CV, but gives them the skill of doing that thing. And that's, is one of the things that we try and do as well, because it's super valuable to learning and being kind of able to do something.
Yeah, that's a really valuable distinction. I mean, I think experience it's almost a word that's not super useful because it means so many different things. You have, especially like, here's a technology and here's some experience, but I mean, we're in software dev. You don't ever actually do the same thing twice. And you don't, like, as you mentioned, the context is always changing. And you can get, like, the way you walk into something, like you have a little side project that may actually be doing something that's a bit more sophisticated than you're going to need to do in production. So that's something, but it's never run on that scale before, and you've never had those like reliability constraints before. So that's also quite different. Much of this is like exposing what you've actually got and where you want to go.
I'm going to summarize your point as that a software engineer's career has the dry principle built in. You know, they don't repeat yourself. I feel like that's like a fun meta way of explaining it. There's a very useful thing called Bloom's taxonomy as a way of thinking about the kind of the outcome of learning. So I talked about ICAP as a framework for thinking about what kind of learning there is. Bloom's taxonomy is technically Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive learning is about the outcome of learning, and it's these 6 levels, which, if you can bear with me, I will talk about briefly. So there is like this one level which is like merely recalling something, which is just like, oh yeah, I heard about that thing. There is a level of understanding, which is yes, I kind of have heard about that thing and also know why that matters. There's applying, which is really about applying knowledge, like, oh, you're in this situation, you could use that thing, you could use Clojure for that, or you could use pure functional language to solve that problem. There's analyzing, which is looking at a problem and saying, this would actually be quite a good idea for that problem, and like understanding why you would use that thing. There are 2 versions of the taxonomy where the top 2 things in it, the kind of best 2 that we want to aim for, are switched. But the more modern version of it has evaluation next, which is, I see how you've solved that problem and your way of doing it was a good one and you were right to use that thing. And then at the very top is synthesis, which is, I need to solve this problem and I know how to use that thing to do it. Synthesis or creation, depending on whether you look at the kind of older version or the newer. And I think as leaders, what we want from our teams is almost always synthesis. We're aiming right at the top of that pyramid, but the majority of our actions aim at the bottom. So we do things like passive learning that get people as far as possibly just recall, possibly understanding if they've really engaged with it, and possibly application if they've engaged and maybe taken notes. what we actually want from our teams and what we typically let them do in production is the synthesis and creation part of this, which is like right at the top. And we basically say, go and learn from this passive resource. Hopefully you can then take what you've done and experiment over here, often in production. And that can have consequences, right? Like getting people to do their trial and error in a production environment isn't great. But simulating the kind of doing and having the kind of human interaction around it to reinforce the learning, I think gives you a valuable way of just accelerating people to the top of that learning in a given skill as fast as possible. And so setting up those so in terms of how targeted capability training works, we'll identify a skill and then have people do it in the session, and we'll like build up like, here's a new thing, now go and do it. We'll talk about how you did it, and then we'll move on to the kind of next level of complexity in that topic. Similarly, giving people the ability to do a realistic side project where they have to not just use the thing that they've learned, but they have to use it critically, and they have to sort of be like, have other people look at how they've done it and have a discussion around it, is another way of getting people to just be genuinely able to use a skill to synthesize something new, which I think is what we want from learning that's going to be relevant to people's jobs. I think if the aim is learning that's kind of for the broadening of horizons, then you can really get as far as like understanding. It's quite a lot lower down in the kind of the pyramid of that taxonomy.
Yeah, in other words, you want mastery across the skills that you need for your daily work. And you want a broader understanding of what else is out there, so you can build up a funnel towards mastery.
Yeah, I think that's right. Mastery on the kind of very specific things that you need to know. Like, I'm very happy with, I don't know, all my Python developers being less good at Python than Guido van Rossum. That's fine with me. I don't need them to. I don't need Guido. Like, who I should, for those who aren't aware, is the guy who invented Python. But like, there are so many levels between where those people are and mastery that I feel like it's less about the level that they are and saying, you're a senior, you're an expert, you're a junior, you're an intermediate, you're a level 9 programmer, and more about the skills that you have. Are you able to actually use them to build this product that we're working on? Which is kind of a different question. Like, I feel like mastery is saying, I am skilled across all aspects of this thing. And I think being able to synthesize is really saying, the bits I do know, I know well enough to go and build a product with and for it to be a success.
Yes, there's different levels of mastery. Sorry.
Yeah, I feel like
so what is good enough for one thing may not be good enough for some other situation, but you've attained a certain level of mastery. Let's put it so. Yeah. You need to be the best of the best of the best of the best to be pretty good at something and sufficiently good at something. So.
That's true. Although I think I would still be very happy with juniors and seniors if the things that I thought they were junior and senior in, they were able to use in their work versus just know about.
Yeah.
I've just, Melanie, I'm going to come to your question in just one second. We had someone that signed up and asked the question around wanting to know how much people felt was the right budget to spend, and how much other people did. So we've mocked up a training budget, which should, we've mocked up a poll on training budgets, which should work. So you should be able to see that and vote on that if you'd like to. It's all obviously anonymous, so just you can see what other people view as what they think is a reasonable budget to allocate on training, just so we can get a real good snapshot. So I'll tell you what, I'll leave that up and I will move on to Melanie's question. So feel free to just tap away at that. So Melanie said, I have a question about ways to measure the results of training that don't result in a side project or applied skills. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think talent retention is a great way to measure that. Like, I think this is one of my key things, and I've kind of brought it up already, so I don't want to labor the point. But it's like, you join a company, you leave your manager, but you stay for themselves, and that's learning, that's improving yourself, improving your skills. I don't know if there's a tangible metric you can put on that, attrition rate maybe, or exit interviews stating that kind of thing. But I do measure sort of employee happiness in that level of training.
Davey, I'm going to disagree with you, partly to Melanie's point in the chat about attrition is a lagging rather than leading indicator. And so, you know, it's far, far too late by that stage. But also, in my mind, attrition is going to be, well, retention or attrition is going to be a byproduct of having a great environment. And so, you know, I want engaged engineers in my team because I know that they're more productive, they're building better products, and they're happier if they're doing all those things. And if I do those things right, then they will stay.
Yeah, one way to measure that might be the kind of what do they call it? Like I think Spotify call it a traffic light thing, where they send around a survey to all their employees every month, 3 months, and it has a load of questions. And one of them might be how much you feel like you're progressing as a developer, for example. How happy are you in your job? And that, I think, would give you some leading indicator on whether people are likely to leave as a result of not learning. But I think the results of training depend on what the outcome of training you want, right? Because if you're aiming your training at employee retention, horizon broadening, the warm and fuzzies of I am learning and that's a good thing, then I think that leads to a really different kind of outcome versus the company needs this. We're like, we haven't shipped in 18 months. We need everyone to learn Clojure so that we can start shipping code again. Or we need to have developers on the team who are better at management, or who are just more skilled at Python. And therefore, actually the outcome there is I've saved on hiring budget by taking my existing people and making them be better at Python, or that people feel better supported by their line management. And so I think if you're aiming your training at solving commercial problems, then you should be able to see commercial outcomes from training. And if you're aiming your training at, like, you know, team retention, and your budget is commensurately lower, then you should be looking for happiness kind of indicators.
Yeah, thank you. This is something I'm interested in because I'm grateful for my technically skilled team. So any training I give them, I'm doubtful, like they're very skilled, but I know they're hungry to learn. And being an engineer, I like to know that what I'm doing makes a difference. I want to be able to measure the impact somehow. So this is what I'm curious about. So
I think, Melanie, as already been said, it depends on what you're training for, right? So training in its best form is, if you're not trying to improve something, it's probably not training, right? So if you're clear, I want to improve number of bugs per lines of code written, or the amount of time it takes to get from story is ready to story is done, or. So you aim your training at a specific thing that you're trying to fix, right? And so therefore, if you know what you're trying to fix and you aim your training at that, you can measure it very easily. If you're training more broadly just to broaden people's horizon, it's things like your engagement score, your eNPS that goes up. So we're using Office Vibe to measure all kinds of things. And you can see in there that people talk about training, and some people are super happy that they're learning things, and some people think, oh, I don't know really how things are going. So if you're using something like Office Vibe, you get a fairly reasonable proxy that allows you to measure your effectiveness of the general training, let's say, or the visionary broadening your scope training. If you are saying I need to use training to fix a specific problem that I have, you hopefully know have measured that problem in some form or other, and you have the metrics in place to see the improvements. Right? If you don't measure anything, then better start there, because if you don't measure anything, you can't measure the impact of your training. Sorry, that was pretty obvious.
No, it's a good point.
Yeah, Sorry, go on.
That's all I was saying. Like, that's a good point. I should figure out what I'm trying to, it's not even fix, but what is my goal for the training, and then go from there. It's obvious, but a good point.
I was going to say we use Peakon internally for that kind of thing, which has anonymous feedback, and we have very specific questions every few weeks around training and engagement and what you want to learn and things like that. It's been really useful for us.
Can you talk about any of the specifics, David? Any specific examples you've got where you've had feedback, for example, and changed something as a result of it, or you've had feedback and you know, you've learned something that you didn't know, or something like that?
I guess it's like basically the bot training people tend to do, those individuals have a higher engagement score. So it's not necessarily we change anything specifically, but there's a lot of feedback early on around the type of training that we do. So we had a Treehouse and a Udemy subscription and one other as well. And the feedback was fairly scathing for those kind of platforms, really. And then everyone who was doing the sort of, I know someone reached out and found a 3JS mastery course, one of the front end developers, and they did that. It was really successful. So we then changed our approach a little bit to look for more very specific, tailored, almost like learning sessions in a classroom, virtual classroom type thing. So I think that's the only where we changed our approach based on the data.
Brilliant. Luke, sorry, I think I might have cut you off at the beginning there. Did you were you jumping in?
I was about to say something, which is that I think on the other side, the outcomes can be things like increased velocity. You mentioned decreasing your cycle time, Thomas, like lower bug count, reducing cyclomatic complexity of code, having fewer review cycles on PRs, essentially measures of the kind of abilities of the technical team to write good code can all be improved by training. The question is finding the right measure, the thing that you care about, the thing that makes a difference for your company. So, for example, we had some companies that were redeveloping their mobile phone app, and they knew that they were going to have higher velocity at the end, and they were looking at whether to do that versus through taking the existing team and giving them the skills, versus outsourcing the development entirely. And so for them, they knew what the end was, and so there was a really clear ROI versus what the quotes they had from external developers were versus from others. For some teams, it can be measuring velocity. So we've seen a team where they improved their velocity by a factor of 4 simply by taking the existing team and improving their skills in this case, it was React, the framework they were using. And it wasn't that they were hitting lots of bugs in production or having lots of problems with React. They just knew that they weren't kind of the things that they were doing, they knew they weren't at a level of mastery. I have to come back to what you said, Thomas. And so I think that can be the kind of commercial, or at least the kind of technological high level outcome from training.
And it should be, right? Because if you're looking at a sports team, right, they're doing a lot of training and a few games, right? And the reason of that training is to become a better machine and to become a better team. That then once they write production code, have a game, they actually have a chance of winning. So that's your segue into the, what's it called? Survey.
Yeah. So there's a great story in the UK where the British cycling team, before, I think it was the 2012 Olympics, might be wrong on this, basically took an approach of trying to find 100 things which they could each improve 1%. They looked for a whole load of very, very small gains, and then maybe not quite swept the board, but you know, UK doesn't always get that many medals, and we did very well in cycling that year and since. And I think it's exactly that. It's finding those small things you can improve, finding, I don't know, this new way of architecting that application, which meant that in 3 months when you came to add a new feature, it was that much faster to do so, for example. All of that stuff does add up over time to make the team be that much more successful. And I suspect in the case of most of the companies here, the technology organization being successful has a very direct relationship with the company being successful.
Brilliant. So we've got about 5 more minutes on the Zoom. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to ask, or any points they'd like to add? Anything else at all to cover before we head off?
So my question from the very beginning is was, how do you get a developer or a team that doesn't realize they have a huge need for training and improvement to start realizing that without pissing them off every single time? Or ideally.
Personally, I'm not sure I've met very many people who don't like learning. Like, to me, learning always feels like a bit of a superpower. Like, taking what you can do and extending it feels really good. So one thing you can do is make those holes really clear to them, really explicit, and say, you know, you think like you're already up here, but maybe we can find these gaps. Like, presumably, if you're right that you don't need to learn, we won't find any. And if we do find those gaps, then wouldn't it be great to fill those? You know, there's a kind of asking someone to prove what they're claiming there, and then demonstrating to them that maybe they're not already Guido van Rossum.
Thomas, I've never found that problem insofar as there's all, I think partly to Hal's point, there's always too many people that are interested in learning, and they're the ones I'm going to give L&D attention to. But if I did have that problem, I wouldn't say it's an L&D problem. I would say it's a coaching and a feedback problem in terms of, why is it important? Why is your knowledge insufficient to do what I need you to do? Or how is it holding you back? Or, you know, to get that conversation moving around what are their goals and what are my goals, and how L&D fits into that.
Oh, just on yeah, to follow up on that, yeah, I agree. For me, it's all about communication. We obviously work in Scrum, I guess, little agile, in that we have sprint reviews, retrospectives, and it's never to point the finger or lay blame. Obviously, any incident management we have, again, it's not to sort of go, why did this happen, or like to who's to blame. Again, it's all about, okay, how can we mitigate this from happening in the future? And going back to your point around sort of the 100 little improvements rather than the one big improvement. Every time we sort of have those conversations at the end of sort of every sprint before we release code, it's to sort of go, okay, what can, essentially we always try and get 3 things, like what 3 things, like small things, can we do as a group that we obviously we won't necessarily do again, or we'll do more of, that we can obviously just continually iterate and improve upon over time. I almost sit silently at the back in those sessions, and sort of they figure it out for themselves. Again, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. 4.5-year-old company kind of thing. The development team as a whole, we've expanded a lot in this last year and a half, that we are still like a forming team, that everyone's still sort of finding their feet, where they fit within the team, within the organization. So again, sort of allowing people to figure things out for themselves is much more powerful than sort of saying, oh, with my experience, or somebody else saying with their experience they would do this. It's sort of like, okay, cool, well, let's see what works. Worst case, we come back in 2 weeks' time and go, cool, maybe we could have done that slightly better, and we tackle the same thing, and we try and do more of it again. But again, it comes down to communication. Sort of just ask them. And I think that touched upon Melanie's question earlier around like, how do you like find whether it's useful or not, or whether they're happy? Ask them.
Right. And most people realize there's gaps and there's a need for learning, but every once in a while you come across somebody who doesn't seem to realize that. So those are the tricky cases that I'm trying to tease out. When you come across somebody who doesn't realize the need, that there's a gap, how do you gently nudge them towards that realization.
And also, how do you get specific, right? How do you get from, I would like to be better at Python, or I don't really understand Kafka, to then the things you need to learn are X, Y, and Z. That can be another problem that I think even people who know where their gaps are, making that actionable without just being like, okay, well, go and watch a load of videos, can be tricky, because I think most people, typically most people aren't aware of what they don't know. That's a common problem. And most people, if you know that you have a weakness somewhere, you're probably not skilled enough to be kind of fine-grained about what that weakness looks like.
Guys, we're closing in on 2:30, so I'm going to bring it to a close there. Thank you everyone for getting involved. Thank you, Hywel, for being with us today, and answering all the questions. Super useful stuff. I'm just going to say quickly, I don't know if there is anyone here that is not on CTO Craft, but if you're not, then it's I'd really recommend it. So there's no official relationship between the London CTOs and CTO Craft, but it's just a very cool Slack group that we recommend as much as we can. There's something like 2,000 CTOs on there, or people on there all across the world, but was started in London. So join that, and I'm sure Hywel's on there, and so you can keep all the questions going if you've got any more. We'll send some information out about Skiller Whale. Is there anything else you wanted to say about it at all, or should we just drop some information?
No, I was just going to say I'm at H, just the letter H on CTO Craft Slack. So if anyone wants to chat to me there, feel free to. Easier to remember how to spell H than Hywel.
But yeah, thank you very much for everyone that got involved. Really appreciate it. As I said at the beginning, we run a tech recruitment company called RecWorks. If anyone's interested in that, then let me know. We do loads of other things around mentor introductions and aspiring CTOs. So if you want to get involved in that as well, then ping me. But other than that, thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Barry. Thanks, everyone.